For those of you I don't know, my name is Brian Levy, and on behalf of the business law team, Tanya Murphy, Jamie O'Brien, and Bill Kirk, I'd like to welcome you and welcome Michael Novak back to Notre Dame. If you're taking business law here at Notre Dame, you know Michael is the author of Business as a Calling. What you may not know is that he's the author of over 30 other influential books. He holds degrees from Stonehill College, Gregorian University in Rome, and Harvard University. He has taught at the likes of Harvard, Stanford, and Notre Dame. He served as U.S. Ambassador to the UN Human Rights Commission in Geneva. And he is currently the George Frederick Jewett Chair in Religion and Public Policy at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., where he is Director of Social and Political Studies. For our purposes, I think he may be uniquely qualified to speak to us, for he's someone who can bridge the gap, or hopefully the overlap, between law, public policy, business, philosophy, and theology. I first read Business as a Calling as somebody who was changing their career. I'm glad that you're all getting to read it, or most of you are getting to read it, as folks who are beginning their careers. I should note that Michael has a new book out, No One Sees God, and he'll be signing copies tomorrow at the Notre Dame bookstore from 3 to 5. We've also got a door prize here for the Q&A. We'll announce a special winner at the Q&A, a T-shirt from Business as a Calling. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Michael Novak.
I love coming back. It's a great thrill and pleasure both to be at Notre Dame, which I love so much, but secondly to be here especially for business students. You are the most important workers for the liberation of the poor in the entire university. You have a vocation that is a noble vocation. I would try to make some of that a little bit more clear in my remarks today. At an age of the crossroads, where much will be done or not done to liberate the poor in the next 30, 40, 50 years in this century. So you're the last best hope of the poor. And I say that to put it in a nutshell, because the only real way to move out of poverty is to have a job. There just isn't any other unless you want to be a serf for the state and get benefits. And you'll never really move out of poverty that way. Where it's been tried, it hasn't worked. Now, what I want to talk about tonight, I call the moral ambiguity of business. I want to present the argument that was going on at the end of the 1800s, at the end of the 1700s, over the faults, the deficiencies of the system then in force. And in trying to imagine what a new system, a better system, especially for the poor, would be like. So I call it the moral ambiguity of business and of everything else. For most of human life, for most of human history, economic life was presided over by great landlords. In the West, by barons, lords, counts, dukes, princes, monarchs. Below them, most people, my own grandparents for instance, worked as peasants, serfs, woodcutters, saddlers, and the like. Travel and transportation were difficult. The vast holdings of the landowners yielded much wheat and barley and perishable fruits and vegetables by the wagon load, most of which they could neither refrigerate nor ship far away. Their commerce, in other words, was limited. So how did they consume the fruits of their land? And how did they acquire wealth? Well, the latter question is easy. They went out and took it. Everybody lived in castles behind walls to protect themselves. That's why they're there. And most of the associations in the Bible from this same type of economy. Our wealth comes by getting, by conquest, by seizing, and dragging the wealth back. How do they consume the fruits of their land? They held great parties and balls and festivals and banquets. And also they raised armies of men who would otherwise, once the harvest was in, sit largely idle. After the harvest was in was the time of war for centuries. They held military festivals, tournaments, and jousts. Think of the stories of Camelot, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Henry V, even on the underside Robin Hood. Great fun, great romance. Yet there were three deficiencies in the landowning order, and there still are today where it's still in existence. Lords and barons had little interest in a market order. Long-range commerce was exceedingly difficult and unsafe. They preferred to protect their holdings and perhaps to expand them. Idle hands, this is the second point, led to periodic warfare, since barons ambitious for glory and desirous of scarce luxuries sought new conquests and plunder. Third, two sets of laws were enforced, unequal laws, one for lords, another for the lower classes, and least of all, the serfs in the field. As David Hume writes in his historical essays, and if you like reading on the side, his historical essays are simply wonderful. This feudal social system down the centuries had done almost nothing to raise up the poor. The poor during the time of Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274, were not in much better circumstances than the poor at the time of Christ. To travel between Rome and Paris, Paris then was only a cow town with muddy streets, few great buildings begun. To travel between Rome and Paris, as Thomas Aquinas did 6 times, was to travel by donkey or horseback or by foot, just as it was for Jesus during his travels in Palestine 12 centuries before. And Montaigne was to write in the 1500s that the same situation obtained. David Hume was trying to imagine, therefore, a new order. Which sort of social system would reduce the almost annual turn to warfare and turn the attention of whole populations to the rule of law and the slow but steady creation of plenty? Up through the 1700s, plagues and famine recurrently cut like great scythes through entire populations, taking as many as 1/3 of the inhabitants of a single city in a single month or two. Economic growth year by year was virtually nil. People talked of good times and bad. No one talked about steady movement toward a higher standard of living. No one dreamed that world poverty could be significantly reduced. The poor you shall always have with you was the accepted wisdom. And nobody thought it was wrong for a system to have lots of poor. That's the way God made it. No one, that is, except David Hume's friend Adam Smith, thought that wealth could be created in a sustained way by a certain kind of system. He, with Hume, was trying to imagine this system. They thought that men could build a system that would result in the creation of ever greater wealth. I want to emphasize that this first vision of what we later came to call capitalism was a social vision. Adam Smith called his book, in fact, The Wealth of Nations, not individuals, and not of a single nation. It's the first vision of a world economy, and it's the first vision of an economy whose purpose is to raise up the poor, to create sufficient wealth that even the poor would be living in a few generations at the level kings and dukes and lords were living then. These are the sorts of questions the American founders were studying even when they were trying to imagine the Novus Ordo Seclorum. Now, how many of you know Novus Ordo Seclorum, the meaning? Any? Oh, come on, some of you. Now, it's funny I asked that because when I went to school, anybody who was Catholic had learned a little Latin. You couldn't help it. And Novus, the new, Ordo, order, Seclorum of the ages. Per omnia saecula saeculorum was the refrain again and again at Mass when it was said in Latin. Through all the ages of ages. Anyway, the new order of the ages they dared to inscribe on the seal of the United States. You know, a bold claim if there ever was one. But they did hope to construct in the New World a Novus Ordo Seclorum after throwing off the not-so-heavy yoke of King George III. He wasn't the worst of monarchs by far, but it was too much. They wanted to live in a free republic, by republican principles, by a republican spirit, and with republican virtues, not under a monarchy. They thought you would need a set of wholly new virtues, echoes from the past, a new spirit, new principles. They wanted to live in an economic system that favored and depended upon the rule of law. They wanted the upward movement of their republic to be toward plenty, a new social goal, plenty, not power. It's an enormous shift in human history to try to shift regimes. In politics, the study had always been of power. And this is the first time in history the axis starts to turn toward the pursuit of plenty instead of power. And the power started to flow more toward people of business, away from the landholders and the dukes and the barons, and the latter didn't like it. The founders wanted an economic system that empowered many individuals, not a few landed aristocrats. They wanted an economic system that encouraged innovation, discovery, and invention. If there's a little time at the end, I'd like to read a few passages from Lincoln on the importance of invention and discovery. As one of the great steps forward in human history, one of the 6 great steps. He called the patent and copyright law one of the 6 great steps forward in the whole history of human liberty. And it's interesting why he did that. So they wanted to encourage innovation, discovery, and invention, not stasis or stagnation, even if it was a pleasant stagnation. There really are people who think if we have no growth, everything will be more settled and people will be more happy. That isn't what they wanted. The American founders held that each type of political regime influences the habits of its people, but each in a different way. Aristotle had noted long before that under occupation by a foreign power, his island, when he was a young man, was overcome by a foreign power. Some people became sycophantic and corrupt, pleasing the conquerors, while others resisted corruption heroically. In other words, the individual does not mature in isolation, but in a particular city. Each individual is a child of his polis, the Greek word for city, which was the main form of government, but we would now say nation, or at least polity. Each individual is a child of his polis. Man is a political animal. Ethics, properly understood, according to Aristotle, is a branch of politics. The character of the polis shapes the ethos. The character of the polis shapes the ethos. That's why elections in a republic are so important. You're partly voting for the character of the people that will result by a change of direction one way or the other. And there always is a change of direction. The press doesn't talk about this, but it's really the subterranean issue in almost everything. As the character of the polis is different, so also is the ethos. For instance, in a letter written to Marcy Warren 6 months before the Declaration of Independence, Mercy Warren was to become a historian of the Revolutionary years later, John Adams took up the fundamental Aristotelian principle. It is the form of government which gives the decisive color to the manners of the people more than any other thing. Since Adam believed a republic demands a high ethical standard from his citizens, he at first believed a republic would not be possible in America. It would not work. Quote, virtue and simplicity of manners are indispensably necessary in a republic among all orders and degrees of men. But there is so much rascality, so much venality and corruption, so much avarice and ambition, such a rage for profit and commerce among all ranks and degrees of men, even in America. And golly, he's writing for Boston, for goodness sake, in 1770. That I sometimes doubt whether there is public virtue enough to support a republic. Nonetheless, Adams had no doubts about the comparative effects of a republic and a monarchy upon moral character. He had been in France and in Britain as ambassador. But a republic, although it will infallibly beggar me and my children, he was being offered to be the chief lawyer for the king in the United States. Well, it wasn't the United States yet, but not just in Massachusetts, but throughout the colonies. And in supporting the War of Independence, he was putting himself in danger of the penalty of hanging, and in the danger that everything they owned would be taken from his children, and they would be reduced to penury. So that's what he's saying. Although a republic, although it will infallibly beggar me and my children, will produce strength, hardiness, activity, courage, fortitude, enterprise, the manly, noble, and sublime qualities in human nature in abundance. A monarchy would probably somehow or other make me rich, but it would produce so much taste and politeness, so much elegance in dress, furniture, equipage, so much music and dancing, so much fencing and skating, so much cards and backgammon, so much horse racing and cockfighting, so many balls and assemblies, so many plays and concerts, that the very imagination of them makes me feel vain, light, frivolous, and insignificant. So later, Adams became convinced that Republican self-government is, even after he became convinced that Republican self-government is morally better, as in this passage, he deeply worried that the commercial spirit would undercut Republican virtue. The argument is, should we build this new system of the ages, on commerce or not? Or, as in the past, build it on the military, or on the landed aristocracy, or on the church. It's got to be built on one or the other. Those are the only alternatives known in history. And he worried about the choice of commerce. I sometimes tremble to think that although we are engaged in the best cause that ever employed the human heart, yet the prospect of successes is doubtful not for want of power or of wisdom, but of virtue. The spirit of commerce, madam, which even insinuates itself into families and influences holy matrimony, and thereby corrupts the morals of family as well as destroys their happiness, is as much to be feared as incompatible with the purity of heart and greatness of soul which is necessary for a happy republic. Thomas Jefferson, Adams' long-life friend and correspondent, shared similar fears. Our greediness for wealth, he wrote, and fantastical expense has degraded and will degrade the minds of our maritime citizens. I mean, here he is living on his great estate, built on agriculture, and he's laying the blame for the corruption and venality on the shipbuilders and the ship captains who went to Asia and everywhere else bringing back tea and goods from all over the earth. These are the peculiar vices of commerce, he wrote, to be degraded and degrade the mind. The spiritual strength of a nation, Jefferson held, lies in the proportion of its citizens who husband the soil. And he believed, like many of the ancient poets, such as Horace and Virgil, that manufacture and commerce introduce rot into the body politic. In other words, a business school is a school of rot. That's the implication he's drawing. For Jefferson, the corruption of morals that arises from commerce is the mark set on those who, not looking up to heaven, to their own soil and industry, as does the husbandman for their subsistence, depend for it on the casualties and caprice of customers, the market. Dependence begets subservience and venality, suffocates the germ of virtue, and prepares fit tools for the designs of ambition. Now look, some of these are powerful arguments. Even today, we see some evidence on their behalf. Montesquieu, whose The Spirit of the Laws was well known to the American founders and much discussed by them, even in the Federalist Papers, is usually regarded as the progenitor of the new American ideal of the commercial republic. That was the phrase they used, the commercial republic. Notice how it fits together with political economy, though it puts the economic system first. The commercial republic. I prefer to speak in our time, for different terminological reasons, of democratic capitalism, political economy. For the first time, human beings are writing not just about politics, but about economics and the relation of the two. Montesquieu's basic insight was that every regime is centrally constructed around one social class, either the royal family and its aristocracy, the military, the clergy, men of manufacturing and commerce, or the lower classes, the hunters and cultivators. In Montesquieu's time, the freest country in the world and the most mildly governed was Britain. He was French, but he gave credit where credit was due in his mind. And Britain was manifestly, he wrote, a nation of shopkeepers, which was a put-down, usually coming from the French. Shopkeepers. But Montesquieu saw it differently. Commerce is a cure for the most destructive prejudices, for it is almost a general rule that wherever we find agreeable manners, there commerce flourishes. And that wherever there is commerce, there we meet with agreeable manners. He thought commerce had an important effect on the attitudes and habits of people expressed in their manners. I believe you can see this very vividly in China of today, as it shifts to being a commercial society from having been a communist society. But we can disagree. Is Montesquieu right about this, is the question. We may test his thesis against contemporary examples. Under communism, shops in Eastern Europe were run by state bureaucrats. Customers expected to be ignored and insulted. I remember going into shops in Moscow and in Warsaw and in Prague, and you could stand at the counter and the girls or the guys would be having a cigarette and talking. They could care less whether a customer came in the door, and even less whether you bought or sold. I mean, whether you bought or not. They were going to be paid by the state the same amount. As the saying was, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. Nothing was judged by merit or results. And the manners were so disagreeable it was almost intolerable. But in the same shops a few years later, under the spirit of commerce, agreeable manners have slowly returned. In Washington, D.C., to go to City Hall for a driver's license and to shop in a private store are two quite different experiences. Commerce does seem to encourage agreeable manners, more so at least than in government agencies. Next, Montesquieu adds another testable observation about building democracy on commerce. True it is that when a democracy is founded on commerce, private people may acquire vast riches without a corruption of morals. And by the way, this is one of the most marvelous things in the United States, I think, and some other countries as well, where there is commerce, is some of the people who are most successful in business are among, not just some, I'm saying, are among the most sensitive and public-spirited and morally wise and generous as anybody we have. Anyway, Montesquieu is arguing that this will be the case. It will be the case because the spirit of commerce is naturally attended with that of frugality, economy, moderation, labor, prudence, tranquility, order, and rule. Because without these, there can't be commerce. So long as this spirit subsists, he writes, the riches it produces have no bad effect. The mischief is when excessive wealth destroys the spirit of commerce. Then it is that the inconveniences of inequality begin to be felt. In America, Tom Paine used an even stronger argument against the fears about commerce expressed by Adams and Jefferson. I have been an advocate for commerce because I am a friend of its effects. You know, Tom Paine, you remember, was one who knew there was a God, hated the Bible, and abjured Christianity, Judaism, other religions. I have been an advocate of commerce because I'm a friend to its effects. It is a pacific system, operating to unite mankind by rendering nations as well as individuals useful to each other. If commerce were permitted to act to the universal extent it is capable of, it would extirpate the system of war. This is one reason, one of the propositions on which is based the later evidence that democracies have virtually never make war on one another. Democracies, that is, built on commerce. There are fake democracies that are actually based on something quite different. Alexander Hamilton's observations from his own upbringing in Jamaica also brought him to lessons almost opposite to those of Jefferson. Hamilton argued that men do not work well in uncongenial fields. In nations, therefore, in fields that are uncongenial to them, activities that are uncongenial, they don't do well. They don't like the work. Therefore, the larger the variety of occupations in a regime, the more abundant the flowering of human talent. If there are enough varieties of work, of labor, of spending your life, it produces a greater flowering of talent because people love what they're doing. A plumber, an electrician who's really good, do such beautiful work, and they love doing it. At the end of the day, they have something they can see that they're quite proud of. And Hamilton writes, to cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind by multiplying the objects of enterprise is not among the least considerable of the expedients by which the wealth of a nation may be promoted. Even things in themselves not positively advantage sometimes become so by their tendency to provoke exertion. Every new scene which is open to the busy nature of man to rouse and exert itself is the addition of a new energy to the general stock of effort. I think when I read that the guy who invented hula hoops may have made a fortune for himself and many others. I'm not sure it was so socially useful, although it did provide a lot of fun for a decade or so on college campuses and elsewhere. But there are things made, in other words, as Hamilton points out, that not in themselves seem so socially beneficial, but they become so by their other effects. In direct opposition to Jefferson, Hamilton adds that the spirit of enterprise must be less in a nation of mere cultivators, mere farmers, than in a nation of cultivators and merchants. Less in a nation of cultivators and merchants than in a nation of cultivators, artificers, that's manufacturers, and merchants. You should have the variety. In a nation in which enterprise multiplies the fields of activity, the tyranny of a majority is less likely. In other words, people in one profession tend to have political ideas which support that profession. Agricultural interests have one view. Manufacturing interests have another view. Transportation interests have another view. Oil interests have another view. And the more variety of these there is in a regime, the better protection for individual human rights there is likely to be. Because there won't be any one majority to become tyrant over all. There'll be changing coalitions. And this, by the way, was the principle on which the Constitution ended up being built. Finally, Alexis de Tocqueville, the French historian, about 1830, after 1830, also praises the spirit of commerce in America. It's so different from France at that time. He sees both its dangers and its positive advantages. At first, he seems to give a sharp rebuke to Jefferson. Democracy not only multiplies the number of workers, it gives them a distaste for agriculture and directs them into trade and industry. And from his point of view, agriculture, while noble and beautiful in many ways that Jefferson celebrated, also left you idle half the year. And he thought dulled the imagination and the horizons. You can't say that today with farmers over the Middle West, for example, knowing more about markets in Asia and China and Latin America than the normal city dwellers do. Because they can sell abroad. And they can develop new products to meet tastes that don't exist here at home. Anyway, Tocqueville goes on, in a modest way only. Commerce does not produce high virtue, he says. It doesn't produce high virtue, but it does prepare the soul for it. And here's the way he argues. The doctrine of self-interest properly understood. You know, properly understood means understanding that I'm just not alone. I depend on many others and on a whole social system. So self-interest, rightly understood, is a larger concept than a narrow self-interest which ends at the individual self. And he was struck by the degree by which Americans did this spontaneously. The best example of it was given me by a poster from the Center of Concern, which I saw in the hallway of one of the classroom buildings here at Notre Dame some years ago. It was urging Notre Dame students to volunteer for some weeks to work for the poor in, I don't remember where, Guatemala or wherever the people going to build homes and schools for the summer or several weeks. And then it said, this will do more for you than it will for the people there. And he said it's just astonishing to him that even when people are engaged in socially important and public-spirited labors in the United States, they talk about how it benefits them. That is, they have a sense of self-interest rightly understood. They understand how that's in their self-interest. But it's a large idea of self-interest. Anyway, the doctrine of self-interest properly understood does not inspire great sacrifices, but every day it prompts some small ones. By itself it cannot make a man virtuous, but its disciplines shape a lot of orderly, temperate, moderate, careful, and self-controlled citizens. You know, people show up for work on time. And they are taught in Target and Walmart and every other place, and all the more so in the better hotels and restaurants, to be very polite and considerate and courteous toward the customers. And at places like Home Depot and others, taught to know where everything is. And if you're asked a question, walk the people to it. Don't say, go down that aisle, turn left, and then right. So, in these ways, commerce does not lead the will directly to virtue, but it does establish the habits which unconsciously turn it that way. The inner structure of commerce, he goes on, encourages many garden variety virtues, my word, but now quote from him. In democracies, the taste for physical pleasures takes special forms which are not opposed by their nature to good order. Indeed, they often require good order for their satisfaction. Nor is it hostile to moral regularity, for sound morals are good for public tranquility and encouraging industry. A little later, though, Tocqueville sees an opposite danger. Carried to excess, however, the taste for pleasure destroys the vigilant protection of rights. When the taste for physical pleasures has grown more rapidly than either education or experience of free institutions, the time comes when men are carried away and lose control of themselves at the sight of new good things they are ready to snatch. Intent only on getting rich, they do not notice the close connection between private fortunes and general prosperity. There is no need to drag their rights away from citizens of this type. They themselves voluntarily let them go. In other words, in this selfish pursuit of wealth, they may not realizing it, but they are setting the country up for tyranny. If nobody loves the republic, loves the general society, the general good, and seeks only their own, then they're ready to follow any tyrant who promises them that. It's by maintaining your sense of rootedness and obligations to your small communities, your small platoons, little platoons, for the sake of the larger, that you keep yourself well focused on the good of the whole community and your own. And while success in commerce may breed moral laxity, Tocqueville goes on, there is a closer connection than it is supposed between the soul's improvement and the betterment of physical conditions. A man can treat the two things as distinct and pay attention to each in turn. That is, the improvement of the soul and the betterment of physical conditions. But he cannot entirely separate them without, in the end, losing sight of both. In other words, to become engaged in commerce, which is his real subject here, is to commit oneself to a vocation that is capable of improving your soul, of making you a better person over a 10-year period or a 20-year period, teaching you more about the realities of life and how to negotiate the conflicts among different people and develop a wider range of sympathies and a better sense of what doesn't work and what does work. It improves your soul. And at the same time, it helps to improve the physical conditions. That's what a company exists to do. But there's a third argument for commerce in the founding period. To invest in the future is to give up consumption in the present. It is a condition of business. It's necessary for business that people are able to transcend their own immediate gratifications. Parents, or even an entire generation, must sacrifice their pleasures for the benefit of those to come in the future. You know, my own generation's parents, who went through the Depression and then World War II, and began for the first time through the GI Bill of Rights or whatever, and the new opportunities, the new sciences and industries that were given impulse by the war and developed all over. That generation worked really hard so the next generation could go to university, which almost all of them did not do. And they lived much more humbly than they needed to pay these tuitions. And they sacrificed a lot of pleasures for themselves for the sake of the next generation. And capitalism demands that at every generation. That's why religious nations, Tocqueville goes on, have often accomplished such lasting achievements. For in thinking of the other world, they have found out the great secrets of success in this. As soon as they have lost the way of relying chiefly on distant hopes, they are naturally led to want to satisfy their least desires at once. And it would soon seem, as soon as they despair of living forever, they are inclined to act as if they could not live for more than a day. In other words, the loss of religion, he thinks, draws in the perspective and makes people live for the day and the pleasures of the day. And thus has cut out the very heart of a capitalist system which demands saving and investment in things which don't exist, of which you yourself may not live to see the fruit, but the next generation that uses these things will. So the font and origin of business, in other words, lies in the human spirit. But a total preoccupation with commerce or with physical pleasures dries out the soul. The cistern cracks and there is no living water. In short, the life of commerce is more closely related to the life of the spirit than its critics often suppose. And so to summarize, despite the ambiguities inherent in founding a republic upon commerce, the founders soberly considered commerce the best of available foundations. Not the best of all possible worlds, but the best real possibility for building a republic around. Commerce increases diversity. the diffusion of power and wealth and talent, and the healthy multiplication of interests in such fashion that no one faction can become tyrannous. Organizing a new society on the basis of aristocracy or the military would not be safe for a republic, the American founders concluded. A republic would need independent, self-made, inventive, creative men and women, unafraid to get their hands dirty, proud of being hard workers, much taken with innovation, and determined to find better, often less onerous, ways of doing things. Independence and innovation, leading to a constantly improving common good, would be the fruits of a commercial society, at least for a free republic, such as in the infant United States in the first couple of generations. Our forebears believed that a commercial society would instruct all its members in hard work, regularity, and innovation. It would teach young Americans to be bold in adventure, like the New England sea captains, who often, as Tocqueville comments, often sailed with weather conditions that would keep European sailors in port. But the Americans were willing to take risks because they knew the difference a day might make, or 2 days, in shortening the version between America and Asia, picking up the tea and coming back. They could sell it for 3 farthings less if they saved that day. And they were willing to risk to do that. So that's where the bold and adventure. It would teach Americans, the commerce would, to be modest in their expectations of gain. Because in commerce, you don't make that much profit per year. You're lucky if you can keep bringing in 1.5% every year steadily. And, Great Britain did that during the 19th century, during the 1800s, and improved the standard of living of its people, the average wealth available to each individual by 1,600%. Doubled it again, doubled it again, and doubled it again between it. At the beginning of the 18th century, the 19th century, only duchesses had silk stockings. 18th century, I think that's what I said. And by the end of the century, every working woman did. At the beginning of the century, very few except the wealthy drank tea or wine or coffee. By the end of the century, everybody did. At the beginning of the century, almost nobody had pins. Pins took too long to make and required too much polishing and so forth. By the end of the century, everybody did. Our forebears believed that in a commercial society, well, I've said that, it would encourage an honest, responsible, self-denying, and future-oriented citizenry. Such a citizenry is especially needed to make free republics law-abiding and prosperous. One example I like, I don't know if, well, you were too young to remember, but you were just becoming aware. 15 years ago, there was a ton of books about the fall of the United States, decline. And we'd been on top, and now we're going to go into decline because of the new energy of Japan and the European community. And that made Americans mad, especially in business. And they came out, they made huge investments. Reagan cut the capital gains tax, and they made huge investments in new industries which simply didn't exist then. These little telephones, cell phones, personal computers, fiber optics, genetic medicine. None of that existed when Reagan was elected president in 1980. I'm just using it as a marker, not as a political statement. 1980. And then there has been a tremendous burst of invention and discovery, and American corporations once more lead the world. So the reason I'm saying that is, if you're too wealthy, too successful, you go slack. You're not pushed by anybody. And morals start to decline. Since then, there's been more and more emphasis in our universities. We're not there yet. But on raising the levels of excellence, our schools are falling so far behind those of Asia and Europe and other places. Such a smaller proportion of us are studying mathematics and other fields necessary for engineering. Even engineers, who are so crucial for the building of the future. And it's the better example of other nations which has forced us to become competitive again. It's one of the advantages of globalization. On the other hand, the successes of a commercial republic also produce over time various enervating influences that corrode the moral strength of societies. Younger generations take for granted the prosperity won by the sacrifices of their forebears. Some want to escape from the disciplines of a commercial republic. They don't want to work 8 to 5, 9 to 5. They don't want to go to the office every day. And some have contempt for the restrained manners and mores of their ancestors. Generations inured to hard work and self-discipline can give way to new generations that hear other music blowing in the wind and long for rebellion, preferring to luxuriate in idleness rather than to engage in menial work. A generation committed to saving for tomorrow is replaced by a generation heedlessly living just for today. In such ways, the very successes of a commercial republic tend to undermine the moral stamina of the young. The sociologist Daniel Bell, a very wise philosophical man, dubbed these cynical turnings of the wheel the cultural contradictions of capitalism. The cultural contradictions of capitalism, a commercial republic. Put simply, strong morals in, but over time, loose morals out. The very success of the system breeds an innovation of morals in decline. We can see all around us the opportunity for accelerating moral decadence. We're invited to it, solicited by it all the time. But such moral decadence is only a possible outcome, not a necessary one. Well warned against it, we can make special efforts to overcome its attractions. We can encourage one another and strengthen one another. In this way, the greatest task of a commercial society becomes moral and cultural awakening. Awakening of one another and of our own children. And deepening, moral and cultural deepening. A return to spiritual roots. What our forebears called, what it requires is a great awakening. By the reckoning of Nobel Prize-winning economist Robert Fogel of Chicago, the United States is now in the slow surge, upward surge, of a fourth great awakening. It is characterized by a return to basics, an emphasis on family, after so much destruction in the family, and an invitation to the young to develop the self-nourishing habits of will and mind that are the best guarantors of a strong character. Such young people are the best hope of the future vitality of our Republican liberties and our commercial creativity. Well, I'm going to stop here. I thank you very, very much, and I'm trying to leave more time than this for questions. So I will succeed.
Thank you. We've got a, why don't you hold that up for us, Mike? We got a door prize. We're going to have a Q&A. We've got a couple minutes for Q&A. So we have a T-shirt here from Business as a Calling. Michael just celebrated his birthday on September 9th. Did you?
You gave it away.
Well, no. But well, upside now. So who else has a birthday on September 9th? Any September 9th birthdays? 8th? 10th? Here we go. Here's our lucky winner right here. All right, any questions for Michael?
It'll look a lot better on you than on me.
Questions? All right, I've got one. We talked briefly before, a little off topic. Any thoughts about the government intervening with Bear Stearns and Freddie and Fannie and Lehman Brothers? Any thoughts about the government's role there?
Here's where the concept of political economy and democratic capitalism becomes tricky. From an economic point of view, and even from a moral point of view, it's the wrong thing to do for the government to bail these places out. It's wrong to reward. It's not just failure, there's moral failure involved. That is to say, people try to do things that good business practice told them you cannot do. For example, the Congress insisted that Fannie Mae and other lenders not require so much down payment, not have such stringent investigation of the ability of people to pay for mortgages. Just give them mortgages. That's absolutely foolish. But the government commanded them to do it. So the government really obliged these institutions. Okay. But politically, put yourself in the place of political leaders. You cannot let a big company like Lehman Brothers go under without threatening all the other companies and lenders that are intertied with them. And without threatening the jobs of thousands and then hundreds of thousands. Politically can't do it. So you need to find a compromise. Whichever compromise you find, it will be quite unsatisfactory. But, that's politics.
Other questions? All right. Well, Michael, thanks so much again. We appreciate you being here.
Thanks a lot.